Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we were discussing the prediction for the Sharks' upcoming expansion draft. The Seattle Kraken are going to be joining the league for the 21-22 season, and so the Sharks, for the second time in 4 or 5 years, just like every other team in the league besides, of course, the Vegas Golden Knights, will have to submit a list of players who they want to protect from being taken in this expansion draft, and leaving exposed a couple of pretty decent players at that. Now, when it came to the Vegas expansion draft a few years ago, the Sharks actually managed to escape pretty much unscathed. They ended up losing David Schlemko in that, but Schlemko wasn't really a big part of the Sharks that season. He played only for the 1 year as the Sharks signed the contract in the previous offseason, and he didn't end up really doing much of anything for the Vegas Golden Knights. And so the Sharks, at least compared to some of the other teams who had to give up massive assets, like look at the Florida Panthers losing both Marchessault and Riley Smith and a blunder from their GM, the San Jose Sharks were actually quite good. However, it doesn't look as though that's going to be the same case here this year with the Seattle Kraken. Earlier on in the season, I had been bouncing around ideas between whether or not the Sharks would want to protect 7 forwards and 3 defensemen, or just 8 skaters in general, as there seemingly were 4 defensemen that the Sharks wanted to be able to keep on the team and prevent Seattle from taking. However, as the season has gone on, it seems as though that maybe 1 or 2 of those defensemen have become a bit more expendable, and as such, I feel as though the 7 forward, 3 defenseman route is the route that the Sharks will almost certainly end up taking. Now, I end up outlining here these players who I'm pretty sure are going to end up being protected. Many of them kind of have to. Some of them are almost certainly going to be, and a couple of them are somewhat shaky, but very, very likely. So here for the forwards, Couture, Kane, Hurdle, and Meyer absolutely going to be protected. LeBanc, I'm almost sure of that also being the case, though I guess technically if a 4-4 outline of 8 skaters happens, LeBanc would be the odd one out, but I just don't think that's going to be the case. And then finally, as a 6th forward, I have Rudolf Balcers. After the season he ended up having, he seems to be, in my opinion, the 6th best choice to protect on the San Jose Sharks. In terms of defensemen, 2 of these 3 defensemen that they're going to be protecting have to be protected. Both Carlson and Vlasic, due to the contracts that they have signed, need to be protected in this expansion draft. So if the Sharks even wanted to expose either of these 2 players, which they very well may have, they cannot do so. And in terms of goaltender, I actually have Koshinash being the goaltender protected and leaving Martin Jones exposed. And for those of you who might be getting excited that, wow, Martin Jones is being left exposed, maybe the Seattle Kraken are going to end up taking him, I wouldn't get your hopes up. It's almost certainly or certain that the Sharks will lose a different player, either a forward or a defenseman, and absolutely not a goaltender, as there are many other much better options in terms of goaltending from some of the other teams that are going to be forced to leave unprotected one of their actual good goaltenders, compared to Martin Jones, who, maybe a change of scenery could end up being a change in career for him, but I wouldn't take that risk if I was the Seattle Kraken GM. So in this case, Koshinash gets protected, as there's technically a possibility he would be selected, and Martin Jones will almost certainly be a San Jose Shark, at least past that expansion draft point. We'll see what happens by the start of the next season. Now, moving on to the question marks here for the San Jose Sharks, as I've only outlined 6 of the 7 forwards and 2 of the 3 defensemen. Starting with the defensemen, one player who could round that out would be Radim Shemek. Now, Shemek at the start of the season seemed like a player who the Sharks would almost certainly want to protect. However, the season hadn't gone really as planned for Shemek. At the start of the season, he ended up missing the first couple of games, and it was said that that knee injury that he had sustained a couple of years ago never really fully healed and never really allowed Shemek to feel the same as he did. And we saw that during this regular season, where he never really looked as good as he once did when he was that strong, stalwart defensive player with Brent Burns on the first pairing here. Ended up getting, 13 to 15 minutes per night, playing with Marc-Edouard Vlasic, and pretty frequently, I wouldn't say it's too frequently, but somewhat frequently, at least much more so than before, making some real defensive errors. And so now we're at the end of the season, and it seems as though Shemek could potentially be a player that the Sharks leave unprotected. His contract is actually pretty decent, and so the Seattle Kraken may very well end up taking a chance on him, but it just seems as though Shemek is someone who is expendable at this point. On the other hand, one of the other defensemen that the Sharks could leave exposed could be Brent Burns. He is 36 years of age. He has 4 years left on an $8 million contract that's going to take him to age 40. And so with all those factors, you would think the Sharks would absolutely want to be able to unload a player like Brent Burns, but also, why would the Seattle Kraken want to pick up a player like Brent Burns in this situation? Well, it should be, thought about the fact that Kraken are building a team from the ground up, and they're likely going to be building with a lot of players who don't really have that big of cap hits. While there might be some teams that they end up getting a high cap hit player from, because those teams will make some sort of deal on the side with the Seattle Kraken where they say, we'll give you a second round pick if you take our, anchor of a contract on our team, and the Kraken might end up accepting that. But it's also very possible that they're going to have to make moves to try and even make up to the salary cap floor. And while the Vegas Golden Knights, the most recent expansion team, had ended up at the salary cap ceiling within the first few years, there's no telling that that's going to be the same thing that happens with the Seattle Kraken. And the thing is about when you come with an expansion draft, to try and really make your team well known, you probably want a bit of a face of a franchise kind of thing going on. When you think about the Pittsburgh Penguins, you think of Sidney Crosby. When you, at least a couple of years ago, when you thought of the San Jose Sharks, you thought of Joe Thornton and Brent Burns. And so if Brent Burns moves to Seattle, he's such a recognizable player, a recognizable face, that he could end up becoming the face of the Seattle Kraken. He could end up becoming the captain of that team. And honestly, he's not even all that bad on the ice. He's still the guy for the San Jose Sharks. I've mentioned this time and time again. On the penalty kill, he's the number one guy. The power play, the number one guy. Defensively, he's the number one guy. On the back end, the number one guy. All of these things, he led the team in ice time. He was one of the top players in the league in terms of ice time, just in general. And so he's showing no signs of slowing down, at least when it comes to that part of his game. The offensive side obviously has slowed down, but when it comes to sort of that reliability that he does have, even if those defensive issues obviously creep in time and time again, the reliability that he does have and the sort of public persona that he has could make him a very, very popular pick for the Seattle Kraken. So if the Sharks do leave him exposed, it is going to be a possibility that the Kraken do take him and the Sharks actually unload themselves of a contract like that. But the question is whether or not the Sharks, of course, want to do that very thing. It's possible that the Sharks are either going to be looking to compete over the next couple of years if a rebuild doesn't seem possible, or it's possible that the Sharks decide to go for a full fire sale and want the rebuild there. And so it's difficult to predict what the Sharks will do. I suspect one of these two defensemen will end up being protected, obviously, but I cannot fathom which one. When it comes to the forwards, there's another two options, at least in my opinion. There are obviously multiple who the Sharks could protect, but players like Marcus Sorensen, Patrick Marleau, Matt Nieto, all three of these players are going to be unrestricted free agents. And so even if they get taken by the Seattle Kraken, there's no reason that they're going to necessarily re-sign with the Kraken, and the Sharks could technically pick them up in the offseason anyway. The two players who I have outlined here are actually restricted free agents, and as such, if they get chosen in the draft, their rights will end up being with Seattle. And those two players are Dylan Gambrell and Ryan Donato. Now, based on what we've been hearing from the organization and what we know from the coaching staff at the very least, it seems very likely that Dylan Gambrell will end up being the player protected and Ryan Donato will end up being the player exposed in this situation. And that, at that point, could make it very possible that Ryan Donato ends up getting picked up. We saw it just a few years ago with the Vegas Golden Knights that sometimes there were these sort of neglected type of players who weren't necessarily looked at to do all too much on their, previous teams, who then ended up exploding offensively on the Vegas Golden Knights. A player like Jonathan Marchessault was quite solid, I would say, with the Florida Panthers at the time, but nobody expected what he ended up becoming with the Vegas Golden Knights. Riley Smith looked like a bit of a washed-up player on a tough contract for the Florida Panthers, and that's why they ended up getting rid of him in that expansion draft, and yet he also exploded back on the Golden Knights. And so looking at the tools in Ryan Donato's kit, it seems as though that he could be a prime candidate for a situation like that if he actually ends up being taken by Seattle. And so while Dylan Gambrell seems like a very obvious protect, and honestly I'd say there's about a 95% chance that the Sharks end up going with that, it would actually be rather tragic for Ryan Donato to actually be chosen. Now, the question, I guess, in the end would end up being, if, let's say, the Sharks protect Shemek and leave Burns and Donato exposed, would they take Donato over Brent Burns, or would they take Donato over Radim Shemek? I'm not entirely sure about that one, but I will say that leaving Donato exposed will be a pretty big loss for the San Jose Sharks compared to having left, David Schlemko exposed in the expansion draft just a few years ago. So while I don't think this is going to end up being the case, I wonder if a potential deal could end up being in place for the San Jose Sharks to maybe give, not a huge asset, but maybe a small asset to say, hey, how about you lean more towards, let's say, Shemek or Burns and lean less towards Ryan Donato. That's something that I would like to do just because I really like Donato as a player. But honestly, with how he was treated during this season with the San Jose Sharks, it's very possible he ends up getting unprotected, and it's also quite possible he ends up leaving the team. But that will do it for this preview. I guess in terms of a final prediction, I would say Gambrell is the seventh forward here with Couture, Kane, Hurdle, Meyer, LeBanc, and Balcers, and I would actually wager that Burns probably ends up being the third defenseman. I think leaving Burns off of the expansion list may end up being viewed as somewhat disrespectful from Doug Wilson's side, or something like that. Something about the hockey culture might end up leaving it so that Brent Burns ends up getting protected in this one and Shemek gets exposed, though I will not say whether or not protecting Burns is necessarily the correct choice, because it's kind of a gray area in my opinion. Class dismissed.